Welcome to Biosafety Now's 14th Twitter Space. My name is Bryce Nichols. I'm a professor of genetics at Rutgers University and lab director at the Waxman Institute of Microbiology and one of the co-founders and leadership team members of Biosafety Now. Biosafety Now is a US-based nonprofit launched in February of this year, so we're almost coming up on our 6-month anniversary. We're led by experts in biomedicine, mathematics, public health, public policy, law, social science, and public advocacy. And our core mission is to work for a future where scientific research on pathogens supports human life without threatening it, and public trust in science is restored. So you can learn more about our mission by visiting our website, biosafetynow.org. I also want to just give a disclaimer that the views of individuals expressed on these Twitter spaces do not necessarily reflect the views of Biosafety Now. So I'd like to introduce the panelists we have tonight, who are all members of Biosafety Now's leadership team. First, Justin Kinney, who's also a co-founder of Biosafety Now. He's a professor of quantitative biology at Cold Spring Harbor. Dana Parrish, an author, health reporter, songwriter, and member of the advisory board of the Bay Area Lyme Foundation, who also co-authored the book Chronic with another member of Biosafety Now's leadership team, Steve Phillips, which came out in August of 2020, about the underlying causes of infectious disease ranging from Lyme to COVID. Dr. Laura Kahn, who for 20 years worked as a research scholar with the program on science and global security at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. Laura's written dozens of articles on biosafety, biosecurity, and biodefense, and also is one of the co-founders of the One Health Initiative. And finally, Dr. Raina MacIntyre, who's a professor of global biosecurity and head of the biosecurity program at the Kirby Institute at the University of New South Wales in Australia, and a world-renowned epidemiologist and biosecurity expert. I also want to point out that we are potentially going to be joined in a little bit by Australian journalist Sharri Markson, and if she joins us, I'll introduce her at that point. So what I'd like to do, since we have a lot to get to, is I'm going to turn it over now to Justin, who's going to introduce the topic that we're going to be focusing on tonight. So Justin, go ahead.
So, Ryan, I was wondering if you could give everyone a brief overview about the news from Reedley, California, in this weird clandestine biolab.
Yeah, so this is actually a really interesting case because it highlights the potential for illegal labs to be in the community, and the timeline seems to be that in December last year, a local code enforcement officer noticed a garden hose sticking out of the building, which is a red flag for identifying drug labs and meth labs. And it took about 3 months to get a warrant to search the building. So the building was then searched in March of this year, and they were just shocked to discover a biolab in there with, lots of freezers and fridges, nearly 1,000 genetically modified mice, which allegedly had been modified to transmit SARS-CoV-2. Different reports give a list of different pathogens that were identified in there by the CDC, including SARS-CoV-2, HIV, rubella, according to one report, and other pathogens that are generally BSL-3 agents. So that's biosafety level 3, which is the second highest level of biosafety. But this was an illegal lab, undocumented. The company itself was called Prestige Biotech. So it was ostensibly making COVID tests and other products. And it moved to this warehouse in Reedley, California, after its predecessor company called Universal Meditech Inc. went bankrupt. Now, there were already several red flags about the company Universal Meditech, which has a sister company in China. First of all, in 2020, there was a fire in the lab And then in 2022, October, the FDA recalled their COVID rapid antigen test because, in quotes, the product was distributed without appropriate pre-market clearance or approval, which could result in inaccurate tests due to lack of performance evaluation by the FDA. So there were red flags about this company. So then they moved premises to this warehouse in Reedley, but didn't have a license to operate there, and nor did they have any contract to dispose of licensed medical waste. So you'd have to really wonder what was going on in there and what the waste disposal practices were. So, the most notable illegal lab discovered in the US in the past was that belonging to the Rajneesh cult in Oregon, where they perpetrated the biggest documented bioterrorist attack in the United States in 1984. And the lab that they had on their ranch was discovered accidentally about a year after the actual attack. And at the time of the epidemic, the CDC and the local health authorities didn't listen to the suspicions of community members and a local politician who suspected that it was the Rajneesh cult that caused this outbreak of salmonella. And they just said it was due to poor hygiene and end of story. And actually 6 months later, Rajneesh himself confessed that his cult had done it, but he wasn't believed. So that really poses the question. I mean, that case, the Rajneesh case, I use it in teaching in a course that we do on bioterrorism because it just illustrates all the problems with biosafety and biosecurity, in that on the health side of things, there's a real resistance to acknowledging that unnatural epidemics do occur. And there were so many red flags in the actual epidemiologic data that should have suggested this was an unnatural epidemic, but it was kind of ignored. And then even after the FBI accidentally found the lab when they were doing a raid for other purposes on the ranch, nobody knew what actually happened for another 12 years. And in that case, the Rajneesh cult was actually, later it became clear they were using all kinds of methods of poisoning and so on to target individuals that they didn't like injecting poison into the bottom of chocolate boxes or into bottled drinks and handing them out to targets. So because nobody was told about it, anyone who suffered or who had a loved one who might have even died as a result didn't know about it. And that's the point. The community needs to know that these kind of things can occur. So how does that relate to the Reedley incident? Well, I think that there's a whole bunch of issues that come up with the Reedley incident. One is that obviously, how did it happen? The company had some red flags. There didn't seem to be any process for tracking a biological company that had raised some red flags, including a fire and being recalled by the FDA, their product. The first big issue is community safety. Illegal dumping of biological waste can affect humans, it can affect animals or plants in different ways. So you can have waste getting into waterways, and that was a concern with the incident uncovered by Alison Young in her book at US AMRID at Fort Detrick. But it can be aerosolized if it's sort of water spraying out, or it can get into the food chain. So it can get into animals that then get consumed by humans. So there's lots of ways in which illegal dumping is an issue. The second, and of course the other way that it can harm the community is if an employee who presumably lives in the local community gets sick as a result of poor practices in the lab or just accidents, which are really common actually, then it could spark an epidemic in the community. The other issues are obviously around the ethics of keeping animals in humane conditions like this. And to me, the issue that stands out is what's the ability of law enforcement and intelligence agencies to detect such operations. We are used, I think most agencies think of sort of high consequence pathogens and monitoring for that and monitoring for certain types of lab equipment. But the landscape has changed. There's like a vast array of potential pandemic pathogens today. There's also synthetic biology, and which is where you can create a pathogen from scratch in the lab. And there's gain of function research, and all of these are published. The methods to do these things are published in journals. So, any nefarious actor could take those methods and use them. So, and I'm not saying this was the case at all in Reedley, that they might have probably, they were just making COVID tests and other medical products and didn't have any nefarious intent, but it just illustrates how easy it would be for nefarious actors to set up clandestine biolabs. Now, law enforcement knows that clandestine drug labs are everywhere, right? They have protocols and awareness of the types of PPE and protection that their first responders need when going into an environment that might contain a clandestine drug lab. But we don't have the same protocols and processes even for first responder safety with the potential clandestine biolabs. And I think, we do have processes in place for identifying illegal drug labs, and we could develop better processes for detecting illegal biolabs. And I suppose the other issue is about regulation and compliance monitoring. What is the process once a company is red flagged because they had a fire? Now, a fire can be, it should be a red flag. And what was the process after the FDA recall and the company went bankrupt? Is there a process for looking at how a company that has biological samples and materials disposes of that stuff? Clearly not. Not adequate, because this company was able to just set up a new company and move all their stuff to Fresno, to Reedley. And the other question is, why did it take 3 months to get a warrant to inspect the premises? Like a pandemic pathogen which is highly contagious. If there'd been some kind of lab accident, in December, 3 months is too late. And it was the same with with some of the other notable cases where, FBI, for example, has been investigating people for potential, including the anthrax attacks after 9/11, where it took just the legal processes are very, very lengthy and laborious. So when you're talking about pandemic pathogens, you actually need to be able to respond very quickly. There should be a process to ensure that a warrant can be obtained quickly because of the potential of epidemic infections. And I guess the last issue that I thought about was what this means for national security for the US. And let me give you an example that might seem really way out and unrelated and impossible. But what if a company that's ostensibly making automobiles or cars is actually making a nuclear bomb or nuclear weapons? But it's set up as a business, a legitimate business, and it's making nuclear bombs on domestic soil, right? That kind of deception or Trojan horse operation is much easier with biological agents than with nuclear agents. And again, I'm not saying this was the case with the lab in Reedley, but this incident should be a wake-up call for intelligence and law enforcement agencies that this is a method that could be used, and there needs to be better oversight and monitoring, especially after there's been a red flag. I think it's quite possible that a hostile state can establish labs in any country that seemingly are doing legitimate work, but are used as a shop front for nefarious work. So I might stop there and just see what comments or questions are, but those are my sort of high-level overview thoughts.
Yeah. So, there's, I think people are were very concerned about a lot of, like, one, it's really gross, right? Seeing all this dirty equipment, and there's all these dead genetically engineered mice, and like unhealthy genetically engineered mice, um and I was wondering, could you, like, there are aspects of this that are just troubling to look at, but, like, what specific, like, things do you think the public has the most cause to worry about with clandestine labs like this?
Well, I think it's the risk of an epidemic that begins in a clandestine lab. It could equally begin in a legitimate lab, but with a clandestine lab, at least nobody knows it's there. Whereas with legitimate labs, people know that they're there, and there's nothing secret about them. But if it's a clandestine operation, then there's no forewarning. So if you find strange epidemics occurring in communities. It'd be good if there was some method of trying to identify, but that's kind of very reactive, waiting for an epidemic to happen and then reacting. I think there's a lot we could do to actually utilize the kinds of data that we have access to, just open source data alone. We have a open source AI epidemic early warning system called EpiWatch. But those same methods can be used to harness all kinds of open source data. But, for intelligence agencies, et cetera, they have access to other kinds of data that are not open source, that are way beyond just tracking, is somebody trying to purchase anthrax, or is someone trying to purchase a biosafety cabinet? There's a lot more you could do to build up very complex and efficient systems to track to track warning signals for biolabs operating in the community. And I think that's what's needed, because the problem is the technology is out there. It is getting cheaper and cheaper by the day. I'll just remind you of some research that was done in 2017, published in 2018 by some Canadian scientists and they published the methods of how to synthesize an extinct orthopox virus very closely related to smallpox in a lab. So they showed that it could be done, and for a relatively modest cost. So that caused a lot of concern at the time, because until then people thought it was just too technically complex to make smallpox using synthetic biology. What that means is if someone wants to use smallpox, they don't need to break into the CDC or Vector in Russia to steal it. They can make it, right? And that's been shown now that it is possible to make it. And those same authors have published a follow-up paper. First of all, they said that it's no longer possible to eradicate any infection because you can make infectious agents in the lab. But secondly, they showed the exponential decline in the cost of technology for synthetic biology. And it's the same for gain-of-function research. The cost has just come down dramatically, even in the last 10 years. And the methods are open. They're available, right? So anyone can just look up a paper on how to do gain-of-function research on influenza or SARS-CoV-2 or whatever your favorite pathogen is, and use those methods. And this is where the illegal labs are a real concern. So I think there needs to be better recognition of how accessible the technology is and how far the technology has come, even in the last 10 years, that it now poses an existential threat, I believe, And yes, the work we do in terms of trying to reduce the risk of, lab leaks from regulated legitimate labs is really important because that could equally be the source of a pandemic. But there's this whole other landscape of illegal drug labs, and I don't think there's illegal biolabs, and I don't think there's adequate awareness of the risk, and we're still in the infancy of developing methods to try to track them.
So Justin seemed to have a connection issue. So thanks, Raina. I guess it always, yeah, we have a lot of work cut out for us. But I wanna go to Laura because Laura's been also interested in this topic for at least a decade. Um, Laura, you wanna? I guess you wrote an article back in 2012 about do-it-yourself biology. Do you wanna comment on this subject?
Yeah,
Give a perspective.
sure. Thanks, Bryce, and greetings, everybody, wherever in the world you might happen to be. Yes, so these issues aren't really new. I mean, there was a lot of concern over a decade ago about do-it-yourself labs where people would set up their own biology labs in their garages or in their basements and doing work. The FBI was aware of it, but it wasn't quite clear how to address it at that time. And and quite honestly, Raina brings up the Rajneesh cult, which is a classic case. But I think the COVID-19 pandemic's really been a game changer because, quite honestly, these issues did not generate public interest before the pandemic. And you had all these little sputtering cases of the Rajneesh cult or other lab accidents that would cause a few people to get sick or maybe a small outbreak, but nobody really paid too much attention to them. And there really wasn't, I mean, there was certainly the hypothetical risk for a pandemic, but nobody really believed that a pandemic would happen, certainly not at the level of COVID-19. But I think COVID-19 has really been a game changer. And now there's a lot more interest, just, the number of people listening in tonight. Um, I've often liked to compare and contrast nuclear issues with biological issues. And certainly since World War II, after the atomic bombs, there was a lot of concern about the spread of nuclear weapons, justifiably so. And the Atomic Energy Commission was established to oversee it, those issues, and that was eventually succeeded by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission with oversight of all things nuclear to, keep to ensure safety and security on those issues. We don't have a similar situation with biological issues. Certainly, we had the offensive biowarfare program that Nixon ended in 1969, and it was ended because of a number of mishaps that occurred that caused, flocks of sheep to die from open air testing, things like that, led to enough public outrage to get Nixon to ban the offensive program and to start the Biological Weapons Convention of 1972 to get that to come into fruition. Although we still have problems with oversight, regulatory oversight, it doesn't really have any teeth. But we need, I think, what these cases point out is I think we need to have kind of a biological regulatory commission analogous to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, where we have it's an independent agency with oversight of all things pertaining to biological labs, whether they're licensed labs, research labs, or particularly clandestine labs, investigation of it. I mean, we just don't have really the government agency capable of doing this kind of work. So I think cases like this highlight, certainly now going forward, we need to have that kind of oversight.
So Uh, Laura, thanks. Could you say a bit more about so one thing that really struck me from reading the articles about the Reedley lab were that there was a lot. There seems to have been a lot of confusion across the bureaucracies. It wasn't clear whose responsibility
Yeah.
it was to do what, and it ended up involving something like 14 government agencies.
Right.
Um,
Well, that's got an interesting history. And part of that goes all the way back to the Constitution. I hate to say it, because the U.S. Constitution, national security is a federal responsibility. And public health, which really did not exist back in the late uh, uh, 18th century, 18th century, 17th century, certainly, there was no public health. Um, public health was a local, state and local responsibility. The addressing epidemics, outbreaks was a state local responsibility. Keeping plagues out of the country was a federal responsibility. So quarantine, for example, ships literally means 40 days. The ships have to stay in port if there's an outbreak on the ship. The nation had a responsibility, federal government had a responsibility to keep the ships out, to keep a pandemic out. Uh, so what that means, though, is that the Constitution, by its structure, splits up responsibilities. On the one hand, national security is a federal responsibility. Public health is a state and local responsibility. But if you have something like a bioterrorist attack, then we saw during anthrax, nobody knew who was in charge, because on the one hand, it was an attack against our national security, so it was a federal responsibility, but it was a public health crisis, so then it was a state and local responsibility, and everybody was pointing fingers at each other. Well, who's in charge? So similarly, when we're dealing with biological issues, again, public health is a state and local responsibility. The role of the CDC is strictly advisory and supportive. They have to be invited by the states to come in, although they now have field offices. But again, who's in charge is just as confusing now as it's been historically because of these divisions of responsibilities. So we need to figure out how to address that better, or we will continue to suffer, all of this confusion with different agencies not knowing who's in charge. And we see it time and time again, but, given the state of our politics here in the US, it's hard to make any headway on anything. So anyway, so that's part of what we're seeing here.
yeah, that's very concerning. And I think it's a good point to note that despite concerns of many federal agencies that that COVID-19 might have arisen from a lab leak, there has been no change in the biosafety regulations in response to that. There's been,
Right.
I think, literally none.
Yeah, there's been and look, it's very concerning that we really stumbled in terms of our public health response. That's very, very concerning and does not bode well for future responses, that we couldn't get our act together for COVID. Whether it's naturally occurring, deliberately occurring, a laboratory accident, whatever, we couldn't get our act together to respond appropriately. And that should generate a type of bipartisan commission to investigate, the same as we did after 9/11. We need to have a bipartisan investigation into there has been certainly with the origin, but it's only been one party. But we need to look at the public health response and the botching of it as well, in order to try and make some adjustments and improvements before the next time something like this happens.
I was going to just ask you while you're, talking about this, what do you think, will there be consequences, and what do you think they will be, or what do you think they should be? And in the past, have there been consequences for these kinds of clandestine labs that were found?
Well, I mean, what do you mean by consequences? I mean,
Will they be penalized? It's a biotech company. Will they be sanctioned in some way? Like what will be? Will there be any consequences for this?
Well, the question is
them?
who's going to do that? I mean,
Right.
we don't have a government infrastructure in place to even handle it, much
Yeah.
less impose a penalty. That's why we need something like a biological regulatory commission that can handle stuff like this, because right now there's just, nothing. And look, this has been a serious problem for a long time, just in terms of oversight of laboratory acquired infections. There really isn't any oversight aside from the select agent program, which just focuses on select agents. But the CDC oversees biological agents, but they do not have a mandate for occupational hazards. The National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health oversees occupational hazards, but they only focus primarily on injuries or toxic waste, chemicals, or radiologic. They do not oversee biologic. So, these issues fall through the cracks. The CDC doesn't oversee occupational, and the NIOSH doesn't oversee biological. So if it's a biological occupational hazard, it doesn't get overseen unless it's a select agent. And again, in terms of responding to that, well, that's a state and local responsibility. So we're trying to respond to these issues kind of with our hands tied behind our backs, because we have a patchwork quilt of capabilities from state to state. And some states have, very dysfunctional public health infrastructures. Public health has been, even after this pandemic, severely cut to a skeleton level. A lot of the people are retiring or quitting because they're just so, traumatized or burnt out from the pandemic. So it's a very concerning situation that we find ourselves, and we need leadership, but we're not getting it right now. I mean, we've got so many like I said, we've got so many political problems in this country. It's hard to make any kind of headway in some of these critical issues that face us and that are not going away.
I might add to that. The other problem is that the consequences we're worried about is epidemics and pandemics, right? And that is in the realm of health. So the health sector responds to those. Mm-hmm. But there's been just a very long-standing historical inability of the health sector to even consider unnatural causes of epidemics, and I've gone into that in detail in my book, Dark Winter. But the Rajneesh case was a good example. But there's been no examples of an unnatural epidemic where the health sector has said straight away, oh, this is unnatural. It's not part of our training in medicine or health or even public health to ask the question, is this epidemic natural or unnatural? So you've got the health sector responding to epidemics that may well be unnatural in origin, and there is an inability to actually ask the question. And so I think the solution is actually more interdisciplinary approaches where, it's not just left as that our responses are not health centric, but are integrated with other agencies and other disciplines, so that problems that arise can be thought, and the COVID origins is a great example, right, where you've got basically virologists claiming the intellectual high ground on the question and saying that nobody else can answer the question.
Yeah.
And that in their opinion, but you cannot actually answer the question of origin from a phylogenetic tree. You just can't. That is part of the intelligence you need, but it's not all of it. There's a whole lot of other evidence you need to consider when thinking about origins, and health and medical and virological people don't have all those skills. You really need groups of people with interdisciplinary expertise that bring in the more forensic type of analysis of other streams of evidence like satellite signals and mobile phone signals and circumstantial evidence like people getting sick in a lab. All of that needs to be put together to answer the question of origins. And there actually are tools. There's one called the Grunow-Fink criteria, which was developed by these two scientists, Grunow and Fink, military scientists, to look at an outbreak of tularemia, which ended up being a natural outbreak. But there are tools, and it's in the US Army military medical textbook. But nobody in public health has ever heard of those tools or uses them. So there's this huge disconnect in that field, and I think that's one big gap that needs to
I agree.
be addressed.
And that was one of the prompts for the whole One Health movement, was because, well, the classic case is West Nile virus, where this was back in spring of 1999, when you had birds, particularly crows, showing severe neurologic problems and then keeling over and dying by the hundreds. And nobody knew what to make of them. And then people started getting sick and dying from neurological problems. And it was a veterinarian in the Bronx Zoo who realized that, you know, the whatever agent was killing the crows was probably affecting the humans too. But nobody wanted to talk to her because she was a veterinarian and nobody cared about the birds. So, I mean, part of the whole impetus of One Health was to get physicians and veterinarians to talk to each other. Now, this was a presumably naturally occurring zoonotic spillover event. Now you bring in the concern that it might be deliberately, introduced, and that brings a whole nother element to the whole outbreak or epidemic investigation, that we saw, problems during anthrax where, people in the security field, the FBI, had zero experience working with CDC and local public health. They didn't know how to interact with each other, pointing fingers at each other as to who was in charge. And I mean, it's gotten somewhat better now, but still problematic. And, yes, people in medicine and public health generally think naturally occurring. They generally don't like to jump to conclusions that this might be an attack. But yes, we absolutely need to have an interdisciplinary response. But we need, I mean, ideally, we would update the Constitution to reflect the, the realities of the 21st century, because the Constitution was written, like about 100 years before the germ theory of disease was even discovered. So they didn't know what they were dealing with. They thought it was bad air. Some cases they were right, but they had no idea what they were dealing with, and the Constitution reflects that. We need to have a living document that reflects the reality of, again, the 21st century, to give us the tools to better respond to these types of threats. Until then, we're going to be hamstrung in our response.
Do you mind if Dana, you have a quick question? I was then gonna take a question from Scarlett. Go ahead, Dana. Go ahead.
No, I just, while we have Raina here, because I've talked to her about it, and she's spoken extensively about it and talked about it in her book. I think there's enough people here that would be interested to hear your take, if you don't mind me asking, about all this news on the melting ice pathogens, all the pathogens that are stuck, and the risk of causing a pandemic. Now, I know you have really deep insights on this, and I wondered if you wouldn't mind sharing, since it's such a hot topic right now.
Sure. So, I mean, the whole idea of the whole narrative about extinct viruses emerging from the melting Siberian permafrost has been going on for at least 10 years, if not longer. And to me, it's part, the risk of an unnatural epidemic, and lab leak is just as probably more likely than a deliberate attack, is much higher than the risk of a natural epidemic. And but when we don't ever ask the question, is it natural or unnatural? Well, of course, you're never going to detect unnatural epidemics. But in today's world, with the kind of technology that's available, and with our absolute, we are deaf, dumb, and blind when it comes to illegal labs, even legal labs, and the risks associated with research on high consequence pathogens. And we've done some research on that, trying to calculate the risks of natural versus unnatural epidemics. And in my view, just because of the technology available and how easily accessible it is, the risk of an unnatural epidemic is far higher than the risk of a natural epidemic. So we should be routinely asking that question of every epidemic. But we're a long way from getting to that point. And then the evidence, or the way you investigate an outbreak to determine what the origin was, has to be interdisciplinary. You have to work with other disciplines, use other methods. You can't just look at the genome of a virus and determine where it came from. You just can't.
So should we be looking at those articles, because there is a barrage of them now, with
Yeah,
greater
sorry, that
skepticism?
I sort of got a bit sidetracked there, Dana. But in my book also, I talk about this information warfare, this
Yes,
constant
exactly.
tug of war between narrative and counter narrative. So
Yep.
the people who are invested in and whose careers depend on doing gain of function research, push these narratives about
Yep.
zoonotic origins and natural origins, and one of those narratives is melting permafrost.
Yep.
And it's and when you look back at tobacco science and even at climate science now, you see the same thing. You see narrative and counter narrative. It's a constant tug of war in between parties with vested interests that are trying to control the information space, and it's far more of an issue now because of social media and the sort of widespread access to information that we have. So, I think the likelihood of the next pandemic coming from the melting permafrost is pretty low. If we see a pandemic of smallpox or some extinct virus, it's probably, emerged from a lab.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you said it, and now I can stop, um, arguing with people about this, and I'm just going to grab that and play it for them, because it's really, every time I see these posts and these articles, I think of you, and I think, oh gosh, information warfare again.
Well, the X Files, in a way, might have been an early cause of that. There was an X Files episode caused by some microbe coming out of melting ice, and yeah, causing problems. So it's hard to go up against the X Files.
I'm gonna go. I'm gonna have Scarlett's been waiting a little bit. Scarlett. I'm gonna unmute you, and you can ask a quick question, because I think, yeah, to either, I guess, to Raina or Laura or whoever. Actually, go ahead. Go ahead, Scarlett. Go ahead and unmute
Yeah,
yourself.
thank you for this space. So I have a very difficult question to ask. I know this is being recorded, but given that communist China has been, uh, persecuting the Uyghur Muslims in the southern province, I forgot the name of the province. How do we know that they are not using them as lab animals for testing all these biological weapons?
I'll go ahead and take that one. Well, how would we? Well, we don't. I mean, I don't. That. Hold on. We wouldn't know that. I guess. I mean, I don't know. Can you unmute yourself again? I'm wondering what's your goal here with that
Well, the
question? You want
question is
to?
because it's a
Well,
see if they can use humanized mice. I mean, they we know that they have been. There's this group called Falun Gong that have been complaining about how the CCP has been
right.
exploiting them for organ theft. So it's all
Okay.
very scary
Yeah.
because that the
Well,
reason I'm asking this because if we don't get to the
hold on.
bottom of this
Yeah.
COVID origins, China can do anything they
Right.
want to.
Well, hold on. I mean, look, U.S. can as well. I'm not. The problem with all the geopolitical issue, like I understand the desire to blame countries, and there's a lot of ramping up of animosity with the U.S. and China right now. I think, certainly Richard has made this point, and I agree with him. I mean, there's this sort of a dual culpability here. The U.S. and China are both very much, if the origin is a lab-based origin, I think we have to look at blame on both sides here. Now, do I don't know what that looks like, but for us, to me, it seems like the key thing is for us to figure out how we can actually stop this stuff from happening in the future while simultaneously getting some accountability. The China piece is, of course, extremely complicated. Accusing them of doing, testing on people in their country, I don't know. I guess my point would be, what is the other than inflaming anger at China, what's the point of speculating on that? Is there evidence of that? I don't know. I mean,
So, Bryce, I might just add there that, all the superpowers have a history of doing highly unethical research on human beings. We can think about the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, but even during the Cold War, things like Operation Sea Spray and so on, where the US was spraying bacteria over San Francisco to look at how far they could aerosolize stuff and dropping light bulbs full of bacteria into the New York subways, that the British were doing the same. And they were using pathogens that they didn't think were harmful, but people did actually get sick from the Operation Sea Spray, and one person died. So I think, I don't think that I don't think that's unique to any particular country. I think you'll find evidence of course, the Nazis was the other striking example of doing medical experimentation on human beings.
Don't forget the Japanese in
Yep,
harboring
yep,
China.
their biological warfare program. Yeah. So I don't think you can point the finger at any one country. It's a ubiquitous phenomenon across human history.
Well,
well, yeah.
I just wanted
Okay.
to add to that. Like, I think it's important to my mind, the biggest risks come from relatively open science. So it's worth remembering that the research that's thought the research program that's thought to perhaps have produced SARS-CoV-2. This wasn't rogue research. This was research by very eminent very eminent virologists and people in public health. And basically, the scientific establishment thought this sort of research, where you take um, naturally occurring viruses and figure out how to make them more dangerous to humans, they thought that was awesome. They thought that was a great idea. And that research has been going on not just with SARS like coronaviruses, it's been going on in the United States with bird flu. Um, and it's been going on with other viruses. And so, to my mind, the zeroth order thing to do is to stop paying scientists to make these unnatural risks. Um, and after that, like, then it makes sense to worry about the more clandestine stuff. But right now, this sort of very risky research that might have produced the COVID-19 pandemic is mainstream in virology. It's considered a good idea to do, and it's funded, and people get money from governments to do it, and then publish papers in prestigious journals. So, to my mind, that's the first thing to try to address, and the biological tools that scientists now have that are widespread are sufficient for producing lab generated pandemics. You don't need to really test in humans to do this.
Scarlett, I would say one more thing. I guess I understand, this. I don't want to sound like we're apologizing, making excuses for China or whatever. Frankly, as a scientist myself, it is difficult for me to see what's going on in my own profession, much less. So, like, I feel a responsibility to clean up my own backyard. Um, there's a lot, yeah, but I do appreciate your point with you're saying this is recorded. We don't want to upset, Chinese are listening to this. It's not why I'm saying that we need to give blame all around. It's more that we can focus on what we can do, and the speculation about what might be going on in China. I don't know what you would want us to be able to do about that, of course. Anyway, so thank you for your question. I'm going to go to Jason now.
Hello.
Jason, go ahead. Got some stuff going on. Are you able to ask a question, Jason? All right. There we go. That was the first time we've had a troll. Um, so I will. Okay. Can everyone still hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Bryce.
Okay, that was good. Um, so I guess I think Laura and Raina are going to go in a little bit. If there's any, do you guys have any final words? Because I do want to. Justin and I were going to stick around a little bit and discuss the other stuff Biosafety Now is doing now. But we can, um, if you want to ask, go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, well, I just want to thank everybody for listening in on this. I mean, I think the key, as we've seen historically, is public engagement and public demands for change. Until there's enough public engagement and demand for change, nothing changes. Ultimately, we are still government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And if the people don't want gain of function research on pandemic potential pathogens, and they want better oversight of the laboratories, whether they're, known or unknown, it's up to the public to demand this of their elected representatives to make the changes that are needed to improve biosafety and biosecurity and improve the management and to do ethical research. So thank you all for listening in, and please continue to be engaged.
Thanks, Laura. I guess I want to talk to you, about this constitutional amendment thing. I want to come back to that at some point
Yeah,
later.
that'd be great.
Ryan, yeah, thanks, Laura. Raina, I didn't know if you were going to stick around longer, but if you wanted to say something now,
Yeah, I'm available for a little bit more. I just think we have a long way to go. There's such a huge gap, and it's the problem is, you're talking about trying to develop a system that mitigates risk for the community. And whether we're talking about gain of function research that's ostensibly to develop drugs or vaccines, or whether it's the risk of lab accidents, it's the community who's the most important stakeholder in the benefits of such research and the risks of such research. But the awareness of the community of what's going on around them is extremely low. So I think it's really important that the community is empowered with knowledge and information so that they can also drive change and drive an agenda. And it's kind of Similar to climate change, we've seen in several countries that community awareness of climate change has driven election results in democracies. I believe it certainly did in Australia in our last federal election. People were feeling the impact of climate change through, really savage bushfires or wildfires and floods and extreme weather. And you couldn't lie to people anymore because they were feeling it and seeing it right in front of their eyes, and they were fed up with the lack of action from government, and definitely it was a factor in our last federal election. So people have power. People have power to drive change as communities, and I honestly think the solution to the problems we face are not going to come from scientists. They're going to come from the community having enough awareness. Although this incident in Reedley may actually push intelligence and law enforcement agencies to do better and to sort of use similar approaches that they have to the illegal drug trade to try to identify illegal biolabs. But in terms of the outcomes, of lab leaks or deliberate releases, they are epidemics, and that's where one of the biggest problems is that we don't have the right processes in place to even ask the question, is this epidemic natural or unnatural? Today, I think it's important to ask the question of every single epidemic that occurs. And if you don't ask the question, you won't identify the unnatural ones. But that could be the first red flag for an illegal biolab in your community. So I think we've got a lot of work ahead of us to really bring together an interdisciplinary approach that includes the community as the most important stakeholder at the table.
Raina, to your point, and I think this was sort of alluded to before. I thought we had discussed maybe yesterday or 2 days ago the fact that this issue might be something that could unify these very entrenched oppositional groups around the COVID origin story, which is you have the lab leakers and the zoonosis people. But it sounds like we're going to run into the same issues on this, because if this requires additional regulations or oversight that would be similar to what we need for regulation of those virology labs, then they'll actually be opposing this.
Not necessarily, Bryce, because it's quite different. This Reedley case was a commercial business, right? So we're talking about, and when we look back at the history of that lab and the parent company, there were points at which red flagging could have occurred and oversight could have occurred, but it didn't. So that's more around businesses. I mean, one thought that I had is it seems to be much easier for companies with foreign connections to set up business in the United States than it is for the US to go and set up business in some foreign countries. And, somebody needs to be looking at that. And there needs to, you can do a lot with data. We have, we're living in a data age, an information age where there is so much data, text data, visual data, other data streams that are completely open access that can be harnessed using artificial intelligence to generate warning signals. There was a particular company which sort of it was called, well, I won't talk about the name of the company, but they used to pull together data from video streams around the place, like CCTV type stuff and satellite images, and and one of this lab had a hose sticking out of the wall. That's a known red flag for drug labs. So there's so many methods, procurement patterns, violation of different regulations. There's so much data that authorities would have access to that can be harnessed using AI to just generate early warning signals in a way that you cannot do manually. And I think there is a lot that can be done. The other area where I think we need a lot more to be done, and because I work in the space of bioterrorism and biowarfare, I've had a lot of interactions with law enforcement over the years. Is that they're the first responders, right? They are somewhat trained to go into drug labs, into a hazardous environment where their life could be in danger from, inhaling chemicals or whatever. But they're not so well trained about biolabs, and really, any law enforcement agencies who are going into it's going to be the uniformed cops, right, on the street, who are going in to investigate a house where something strange is going on. And yes, they do think about people having meth labs in their kitchen, but they don't think about biolabs. And we saw in even in the Novichok attack in the UK in Salisbury, even when it was known that there was a nerve agent being used there, one of the police officers who went into that house after it was known still got sick from exposure to Novichok and ended up in ICU. So there's much less. We need protocols, for first responders, PPE, and high awareness that, and most law enforcement people will tell you, oh, we've got our hazmat teams. Well, that's nice, but it's the uniformed officers on the street who are going to be at the most risk and have the lowest awareness. And we could do a lot around that as well. Yeah, I might stop there.
Well, so Raina, I guess the other point we were talking about before, is it sounds like we need a sort of dedicated, task force or commission or whatever you want to, like, working group to come up with like solutions for both on the local, state, federal level for this specific issue, which might synergize with the other issue, with regulated labs. Is that something that, because we're talking a lot about, it seems like the scope of this problem is quite vast, right? So,
Yeah.
are there any? It sounds like it does
Well,
need like a dedicated
I
thing.
think there could be some really focused stuff that could be done by law enforcement and intelligence agencies to set up methods to detect illegal labs, right? There
Right.
has to be first an acknowledgement that absolutely there's every chance that there's many more illegal biolabs operating in the community. They accept that there are illegal drug labs. They need to just open their eyes and start looking for the illegal biolabs. So there's a lot that those particular sectors can do using similar methods that they use to detect drug labs, and using data streams that they have available to them to generate algorithms to warn of potential labs. You can look at whole range of things, including, breaches, fires, procurement patterns, even visa data and, movement of people data to flag potential locations as potentially as containing illegal labs. And you can also flag epidemics that look unnatural, but that's quite late in the stage. If you're you want to identify these operations before there's an epidemic. Yeah, but I think that is squarely in the remit of law enforcement and intelligence agencies to develop methods. They've got the technology available to them, and they use it to detect, planned terrorist attacks. They can apply that same technology to detect illegal biolabs.
But what? Just the last thing I'll say about this, because but you started with this idea, which I agree with you, that the everyone has to consider that it might be a lab based origin for these things. It does seem to me that that is going to be a difficult thing to convince people to do, given what we've seen with the COVID origins issue, right? So that's kind of what I maybe was hinting at, where there
Yeah,
might be
yeah.
violent opposition to this.
But I think that's where, and I think Laura was hinting at this, at changes in regulation and laws that would make it sort of essential for the question to be asked and for it to be considered beyond just the health sector, because the health sector doesn't have the skills to answer the question of origins. And they don't have the soul skills. It is an interdisciplinary requirement. So that could be legislated, that if there's a, epidemic of a certain size or with certain pathogens, you could have a definition of epidemics of concern that automatically, the CDC has to work with some other agencies outside of health to look into the origins. If you leave it just to health agencies, it'll never happen. Yeah.
Well, it's a good plan regardless. Do you have a time for some questions, Raina? I'm gonna if
Sure.
Okay, so I'm gonna unmute Jane. Go ahead. Oh, looks like. Well, also okay. There you go. Go ahead, Jane.
Hi, Raina. Jane here. How are you? I'm just interested. I understand that the United Nations General Assembly high-level meeting on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response is coming up in September, and I've just taken an interest in it in the last couple of weeks. And I've read through their political declaration, Zero Draft, and it seems like there's a predominant focus on One Health and zoonotic. But I wondered if, at the international level, obviously they're working towards international health regulations and other commitments, legal commitments on an international level. Is this something that's been advocated on, the biosecurity, biosafety element at this level? Are they deliberately ignoring it? Is it something? I just am interested to know if that's something that should be.
Yeah. Well, it'd be great if they come up with solutions, and I hope they do. But again, I think it's a very fragmented system. You've got the Biological Weapons Convention over there, then you've got, these kind of committees over there. And there's a lot, probably Laura can comment on the BWC, but it's a toothless tiger. It's not able to really make any difference because you can't audit countries, you can't go in and check, and it assumes that the actors are going to be nation states, which is like Cold War thinking. We've come a long way since the Cold War. You've got the potential actors in an unnatural epidemic are vastly greater than nation states. So I think that whole framework needs to be rethought, and I think everyone who, to be honest, everyone who's putting their heads together and thinking about it, it's going to help. But you have to also consider vested interests and who's kind of, pushing hard to avoid finding real solutions.
Thanks, Jane. I'm gonna go to Michael. Michael, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hey, after the last question, sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, I tuned in a little late. Sorry, I missed it. I wasn't aware that we were having a meeting today, but I would definitely like to attend any future ones. I have a couple questions. I believe when I tuned in, I thought I heard Raina speaking about we can't determine the origin of the virus based on the genetics, and I had attended another space with a gentleman by the name of Dr. Andrew Huff, who had written a book about the truth about the virus and coming from the Wuhan lab, and I guess he worked for Eco Health Alliance and was associated with Peter Daszak and sort of had the insider knowledge with regard to the origin, and he's basically flat out said in that space that it was there was a smoking gun in the genetics of the virus, in the sense that there was 16 base pairs that clearly indicated that it was man-made, it was generated in a lab. So I wanted to get Raina's comment on that, and then with regard to Justin's comment. He had mentioned that with this dual use mandate or the dual use legalities of sort of doing research and my understanding is that basically the idea behind these labs doing this type of research is that they claim that they are preparing to prevent a pandemic by creating by doing research, um, gain of function research, where they insert additional functions into regular viruses, say for example out of bats, that they anticipate could eventually one day jump to a human. So therefore they're going to create a vaccine to prevent that from infecting the world and having a pandemic. And that to me doesn't seem to make any logical sense. And I just wanted to see if Justin could answer whether or not that my understanding is correct there.
So thanks, Michael. I think I can actually take both of your questions. So regarding the first question, um, like with SARS, okay, so the feature that Andrew Huff is referring to in the genetics is the furin cleavage site. This is a feature in the genome that the authors of the Proximal Origins paper, that's the feature that freaked them out initially, because when like that feature is not in the most closely related viruses, and it looks kind of like it was just inserted.
Wait, Michael, are you aware of the proximal origin thing, though? I guess.
I'm aware of all of the
Okay.
criticism regarding the 5 well-known virologists recently that were
Yeah.
criticized for covering up the whole situation with
Yeah.
lies.
So yeah, they really started out as whistleblowers. And when they started out, they were concerned about that one feature in the genome. Now, there's been a lot of debate since about whether that feature of the genome, the furin cleavage site, could have arisen naturally, or whether it's an obvious product of genetic engineering. And I think the answer is not clear. It certainly looks suspicious in light of our knowledge that researchers in Wuhan, in collaboration with the EcoHealth Alliance, were planning to insert sequences, very much like that, at that position in the genome, um, as part of a grant proposal that they submitted to the Defense Department in 2018. Now, that proposal was not funded, but it still shows that those scientists wanted to insert sequences exactly like that at exactly that position of the genome. But I think it is fair. Now, the fact is, other coronaviruses, not the very closely related ones, but more distantly related ones, they do have similar sequences. So it's not inconceivable that that sequence could have arisen naturally. It just appears to be very improbable. Um, but I guess my main point is that it looks suspicious, but it's not. There's room for different interpretations of it. Um, what Rhino's talking about with that you can't tell from the genome whether a pathogen is natural or came from a lab, I mostly agree with that. I mean, there are some sequences that if you saw them in the genome, it would be obvious that the pathogen came from from a lab and that they were genetically engineered. But the lab will not necessarily leave any telltale signs in the genome. So even if you don't see anything suspicious, it's really not any strong evidence of a natural origin. Does that answer your first question, Michael?
Yeah,
So I
I
might
think
add
so.
to that, Justin.
Yeah.
I might add
Go
to
ahead,
that
Raina.
the point I was making was that you need many lines of evidence. It's
Yes.
intelligence gathering to determine origin, and there are well established methods to do that, which people in health have very little awareness of, and we have. Some virologists saying the answer is in the virology alone. It may be, as you said, Justin, but more often than not, it won't be. And you need other lines of evidence, like, you need to consider everything, the World Military Games, the people getting sick in the lab in November, the fact that it arose in a city with the top coronavirus, one of the top coronavirus labs in the world, and then the adaptation of the virus to humans. It was better adapted to humans than to any other known species. No intermediary host has been identified. So you need to put everything together, and then there's other evidence like cell phone data and satellite signals and things that can tell you whether a major event has occurred in a particular location. And that was certainly seen during the Sverdlovsk anthrax lab leak, where the US intelligence agencies picked up through their satellite intelligence that indeed a major event seemed to have happened at that location. But the Soviets covered it up and said it was a natural outbreak, and the American scientists agreed with the Soviets and said it was a natural outbreak. And it was only after the fall of the Soviet Union that we knew the truth. But the point was that you need multiple lines of evidence. It is not true to say this is the only evidence. Virology is not the only evidence.
I completely agree. And actually, I mean, that is a really important point to stress, because in the hearing, this is a lot. Well, this is a line that many virologists have been taking, is that they will say, well, no scientific data supports the lab leak hypothesis. But when they say that, they get to pick and choose what sort of data they consider to be scientific and what sort of data they don't consider to be scientific. And so they will choose, for instance, the fact that the virus was first identified, mostly, but not completely, around the Huanan seafood market in Wuhan. But they will not consider as scientific data the fact that the virus was identified in Wuhan, which is not where you would expect the virus to naturally spill over, but it is exactly where you would expect a lab leak. And there's many more lines of evidence. So I completely agree with Raina that it's critical that it's critical that people integrate all lines of information, especially for when investigating the potential for epidemics to be non-natural.
So, Michael, I would also point out that these spaces are recorded. So, if you want to listen to the part you missed, you can always replay it. If you don't get it here on Twitter, we also post it on our YouTube channel, so you can listen to it there. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, if I can, just follow up, if I may.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, Justin, you had mentioned that the chances of it being of a natural origin was improbable. I think Dr. Huff had mentioned a figure of something like 3 trillion to 1. Is that the right neighborhood? And then also with regard to with the conversation about the other evidence, I think that one of the facts that was stunning to me is that China refused to allow any third-party investigation to come in and research what happened in Wuhan with regard to the origin of the pandemic coming out of that physical area. And the U.S. had come out with some statements saying that that was completely inappropriate. And I know in court that if you refuse to produce evidence, then essentially what goes before the jury is what's called an adverse inference, where the judge instructs the jury to basically decide that issue against the defendant because they destroyed the evidence or wouldn't allow the plaintiff to see the evidence. And so I would think that that sort of reasoning would apply in this particular situation, but I'm not familiar with international regulations on who should be allowed to inspect the ground zero for determining what actually happened. I mean, do you have any comments on that?
So with regard to the first part of the question, I think it's just very hard to quantify these probabilities in uh, uh, an objective way. So I know different people have proposed different ways to, quantify the probability that SARS-CoV-2 was natural versus that spilled over in wildlife. And because there are so many diverse lines of evidence informing it, I think it's just really, really hard to quantify. And I think, the data, right? There is no definitive data to my mind either way. I personally think the total weight of the data strongly points towards a lab leak. But I would say there really hasn't been a smoking gun, at least to my mind. Um, with regard to uh, China not being transparent with data, um, I mean, I agree that they have not been transparent, but it's worth noting that the World Health Organization has not been very skeptical of them either. The World Health Organization put together a team to, visit the labs, do their own investigation, and the team basically produced a report that sounded like it had been written by the Chinese government. Um, it said that the most likely, this was in February 2021, the WHO report um, said that it was most likely that that SARS-CoV-2 had spilled over at the Huanan seafood, spilled over from wildlife. It was also likely, they said, that it um, could have appeared in China um, from on frozen foods. So Alina Chan, so this is called the cold chain theory. Alina Chan, I think, has very appropriately dubbed this the popsicle origin theory. Um, and basically, that theory is a way of saying that the virus could have come from other countries shipping frozen goods to China, which is biologically ridiculous. Um, and then they said also that laboratory origin was extremely unlikely. Um, but, one of the I think half the team was representatives from China, and then other people on the team included people like Peter Daszak, who runs EcoHealth Alliance, who certainly has a conflict of interest there. So, um, I think China has not been forthcoming at all with data. It does very much look like they are covering up. And I don't think that there's any um, uh, clear international laws or anything about what one is supposed to conclude from that. But it does seem suspicious. But at the same time, the World Health Organization, to my mind, has been very complicit, and there's been a large population of there's been a very very influential population of scientists who have also been very who have also been complicit in trying to shut down certain possibilities and shut down debate about this in particular a lab leak possibility.
All right. So, Raina, do you have time for one more question? Or I don't know if you, I just wasn't sure on your.
Yes, yes, sure.
Okay. Marvin, go ahead. Let's see if Marvin, can you go ahead?
I'd just like to make a few comments. Firstly, looking at the genetic sequence, there are a number of ways this could arise. It could arise naturally. It could arise through serial passage through humanized mice. It could arise through direct genetic manipulation. These are just fundamentally indistinguishable. You will never generate evidence simply looking at the genetic sequence. However, the probability for a spillover, for a bat to go from the animal reservoir, strap on jet engines and fly 800 miles to Wuhan, and for it to arise here, if we compare to the H5N1 spillover we're seeing animal events in various areas around the world where where mammals interact with the bird animal reservoir. And that's what a natural spillover looks like, where you have a paper trail of dead animals in the meantime, where spillover is naturally happening in the animal reservoir before it travels to populated centres. The fact that there were multiple strains on the initial detection in Wuhan is probably indicative of an earlier initial feed into the human population, and likely some mutation event that increased the infectiousness and led to the explosion in Wuhan. But there were initial ABC strains discussed. So I think that a significantly earlier, months earlier release into the population in Wuhan, followed by an explosion as one of these strains became more developed and became more infectious and exploded and then went worldwide after this, is highly, highly likely. And on the balance of probability, the proximity to a lab that had a written proposal to serially passage and improve viruses for the infection of human, and then have within a kilometre of the dumpsters at the back of this lab, for this to be the seed point where it's first discovered in the community, it's not conclusive proof. There never will be conclusive proof, but you have to say, in my view, that it's definitely more than 50-50.
Well, Marvin, sorry. I guess by the way, I think it always goes to COVID origins, I guess, in these spaces. But I think we agree with you, and I think that sort of points to why Raina is saying you have to look at the totality of evidence that includes all kinds of things beyond the scientific data that emerges,
So
which are being summarily ignored by
yeah,
virologists,
yeah.
and
So
it's frustrating.
I would like to actually respond to some points. So, like Marvin, I very much agree with you that the totality of the data points towards a lab leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. But I did want to address some of the technical points that you raised. One about the comparison to H5N1 is very interesting, right? Because H5N1 is infecting birds all over the world. It's causing massive, obvious bird death all over the world. But it hasn't really, and it goes into humans every so often, but it hasn't developed into a self-propagating virus in the human population yet. And so it's understandable to say like that's what you would expect and not like one single spillover event with no trace. But what I would say though is that the initial SARS outbreak in China was actually much more like the SARS-CoV-2 outbreak in that regard, in that it really first appeared in humans. Um, and then they were able to trace it to civet cats because of epidemiological research, like who was getting infected. It was like food preparers, people at the markets, and then they were able to identify the virus in civet cats, and then eventually later trace the virus back to the more distal origins in bats. But there weren't like all these dead civet cats like falling over. So, and it was a much more silent kind of infection within wildlife, and that did end up like spilling over into humans. Um, but the dynamics there are really interesting to think about. The other thing I wanted to bring up, it's a somewhat technical point that you raised, which is about the multiple strains of SARS-CoV-2. So I, for one, do not think that there are multiple strains of SARS-CoV-2 that spilled over in any meaningful sense. So there was a big paper in 2022, Pekar et al., which claimed that there were two separate spillovers at the Huanan seafood market. But interestingly enough, this week, one of the folks on Twitter who goes by the name Nod, is an anonymous researcher, independent researcher on Twitter, found a major error in the code of that science paper, at least it appears, which greatly undermines the conclusions of that paper. There are a lot of problems with that paper, especially, but this appears to have come from a simple copy and paste error in the computer code that greatly reduced the statistical significance of the claim that there were two independent spillovers. So, okay, I wanted to bring that up, Bryce. I was very
So
glad I got to bring that up.
I know, but you see, Sharri is here. I don't know if Sharri has a phone. If Sharri could unmute herself, I tried to invite her to speak. I don't know. Um, I don't know. So Sharri, if you are able to, please join our panel, so we could say. I don't know if maybe she's not on her phone. Yeah, go ahead, Justin. Sorry, I interrupted you again.
No, I got my origins geeking out. So thanks for your question, Marvin.
He's back. Sorry, go ahead, Marvin. I'm sorry I cut you off.
Right,
Oh,
sorry,
Sherry's on.
thank you.
Good.
I just wanted to
I just
comment
want.
that I don't believe in two independent spillovers. You know, lightning striking twice in the same
Right.
place is completely insane. My comment about the two strains was that I believed in a single spillover that probably happened earlier than has been stated, with the result that there was sufficient time. Perhaps the earlier spillover happened around the time that the database was taken offline, but with enough time for there then to be divergent evolution within the circulation.
No, that's an interesting hypothesis. I I've been wondering about that too. I think the main evidence against that is that there haven't been traces of a more divergent strain, and most of the people who study the epidemiology kind of all agree that the spillover that ended up going pandemic appears to have happened between October and November. Um, but the timing with the September with the database going offline in September and the apparent concerns about biosafety at the lab that happened as reported in by in Catherine Ebon's article were interesting. But anyway, yeah. Uh, but I should I should say hi to Sherry. Sherry, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you on.
She might have lost. It says connecting, but she did have speaker on, so give her a minute. She's probably just.
While she's doing that, you know what? Let me actually go ahead and give her a proper introduction, and hopefully she will actually be able to unmute herself. So, for those of you that aren't aware, Sharri Markson is a Australian journalist. She's an investigative reporter at the Australian and host of the Sky News Australia program. She also wrote the book "What Really Happened in Wuhan: The Cover-ups, the Conspiracies, and the Classified Research," which came out in 2021. Now she's back to listener, unfortunately. I would also point out one of the reasons we were hoping she could say a few words is that over the past week, she's broken some really major news about the origin of the COVID-19 pandemic. So she published a piece featuring an exclusive interview with former Trump administration official Robert Kadlec, claiming SARS. Whoop, got to mute you, Justin. Sorry. SARS-CoV-2 emerged from vaccine research taking place at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and also that Anthony Fauci was involved in silencing the idea that COVID-19 might have had a lab origin in order to protect his reputation, a point that I believe is something many of us, agree with, and in particular, obviously, Richard Ebright has been making this point as well for the last 3 years. So there was another thing. She was also in the news. Maybe I won't bring that up unless she's able to join us. But um, I I guess what we wanted to say is, Sherry, we were very grateful for your work in this area, and we really appreciate the sort of job that you've done. Um, trying to reveal the truth about what's going on, and actually that second piece of what you were in the news for is sort of an unfortunate consequence of being somebody that's sort of going against the norm, where you were, very publicly ridiculed by your colleagues recently in a hot mic incident. Hey, Sherry, are you there? Okay, I can hear you a little bit.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Ah, now I can hear you. Yes, and I hear
Oh,
you're. I think you're with somebody else as well.
yeah, I've
I
got my
don't know.
little one, my little baby. I'm just carrying him up. I'm so sorry. I was having trouble and it was connecting in and out, so I apologize for taking so long to work this out.
No
Oh no.
problem. I was just in the awkward phase of trying to discuss that hot mic incident, partially
Oh
because I think it
yes.
reflects how impressive your work has been and like how difficult it's been for you. I didn't want to dwell on that, but I think it's part of the reason why I think we're very grateful that you've stuck with this. So we appreciate it very
Oh,
much.
thank you.
So
Well,
I guess
I think well, I first started writing about this at the Daily Telegraph newspaper, where I was at the time in April 2020. And it was so hard because there were so many things that I didn't understand.
up we lost you again, Sherry. I'm sorry. Maybe you're in a bad area, cell phone reception
Can you hear
area.
me now?
Yeah,
Yes,
we
now
can
we
hear
can
you
hear
now,
you.
Sherry.
Sorry, can you? Yeah. I was just saying it was so difficult when I first started looking into this topic because scientists kept saying there was no evidence that the virus had been genetically engineered. Sorry for puffing, I was just walking upstairs. And and I couldn't work out, and I was looking and I started writing about gain of function.
Oh
Man,
no, you've cut
Sorry, I
out
was
again,
saying
Sherry. Okay, you're back.
I was saying
the
I
spaces
started
aren't that
writing
bad.
about I don't know why it keeps taking me off speaker. Anyway, I was saying I started writing about gain of function in May 2020, but there was no scientists who I knew who would speak about this. Every single scientist I contacted at the time that I knew, because science isn't my natural field of reporting, they all said, oh no, it's definitely a natural virus. So it just shows how far that now there are entire communities of scientists who are speaking publicly, who can say this needs to be investigated, that there's media everywhere who are reporting this. And like you mentioned, that hot mic incident, I mean, I was slammed in the press in our Media Watch program, which is kind of a program that looks at the media industry. And they basically said I was pursuing conspiracy theories. They dedicated a 10-minute episode, then an 8-minute episode. They just kept attacking my reporting and quoting Eddie Holmes, by the way. They were quoting Eddie Holmes to attack it. And it was kind of humiliating, but I knew it needed to be investigated. So I just, knew that I could stand on my own 2 feet, and I knew my integrity was intact, and I was just writing. It wasn't like I was giving an opinion. I was just reporting. So I stuck with it despite the embarrassment, because I did feel, humiliated and embarrassed at the time. Like it was kind of shameful to be on the national broadcaster television, people saying I was pursuing a conspiracy theory. That is embarrassing. But I was literally just reporting. And so eventually the tide started to turn. So it's been a long journey.
Well,
I
thank you
did.
for sticking with it, Sherry. I mean, it's been it's journalists like you have played such an important role in changing the public's attitude on this. And I, for one, am, and I think Bryce too, we're completely were embarrassed for science. Science and scientists have behaved so poorly throughout this whole thing. And I was very dismayed to see the Australian Academy of Sciences come out with a public statement supporting Eddie Holmes, just what, this week, when he really played a very clear role in pushing this false narrative that there was a scientific consensus on the origins of COVID.
When, as you all know, there was no consensus at all, and even now that we've seen those emails, he didn't even think that it was a conspiracy, but yet he said that. And not just that statement this week, but he won a $250,000 the Prime Minister's Science Prize. He was named the New South Wales Scientist of the Year, and that was specifically for his role in the early days of the pandemic of, as they describe it, mapping the genome and being the first to release the genomic sequence, even though, as we all know,
He didn't do it.
released it he released it at least 5 days late anyway, 5 days after he had it in any case. And it might have been longer than that, but it was at least 5 days. But yet he's literally been celebrated for his role in the early days of the pandemic, when in fact, as you just said, he played a key role in, I believe, misleading the public and calling this a conspiracy.
Yeah, but he didn't even collect that data. He didn't even he got the genome from someone else. He forwarded an email.
Yeah.
Sure. Can you? Sorry, can you hear me, Sharri?
Yeah,
Yes, I can.
yeah,
Yes.
Bryce. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, and I do want to just put this out just to acknowledge it. I don't know if we want to dwell. I do want to say that, I think you're an example too, which is a very thing that's permeated the space, both in the science and in the media. And I is sexism. It's very clear that a lot of the marginalization that's happened to you has been because of sexism. We see that with the hot mic is another example of that. So I just want to acknowledge that that's something that is it's sort of obvious, but then when it's discussed, there's a lot of pushback on it. But we see this again and again in the space with Alina, and Emily Kopp is here as well. And I know Raina's faced this. So I just wanted to just throw that there, just to put a pin in it or whatever, just
Yeah.
to say that we see that.
Well,
And I
I
and I
never would have.
understand,
I
sorry.
never would have thought that was legitimate with regards to me, because I've literally broken some of the biggest stories in our country in politics and other areas. I mean, I've got 16 major journalism awards, so I never thought that anyone in the media industry, that my gender came into it at all. So I never would have agreed with. Sorry, until I heard those comments over the hot mic, and the word that they used, that I was unhinged and annoying. Until I heard those words, then I thought, yes, there is a female element to it, because those are for men, for male journalists from our Canberra press gallery, so the equivalent of the Washington press gallery. Four male journalists from the Canberra press gallery sitting around saying, "Oh, she's unhinged, she's annoying, but she might actually be right." And by the way, even that, no one would ever say they know where the virus came from. All I've been doing is reporting on developments or investigating and uncovering information. It's not I might be right. I've never said or claimed to know where the virus comes from. I've just said that the Wuhan Institute of Virology does need to be investigated for all of these, the gain of function and then later diffuse, et cetera, et cetera. But yes, I never thought it was a sexist thing until I heard those hot mic comments, and I thought that is sexist. There's no question about it.
I do want to though say, Pitbull is a good. I like Pitbull is a good thing though. I thought, but I just to say, I think in some ways, that's really the attitude. You have to stick with it, and that's what you did. So anyway, I don't, that topic is one that there's actually a lot to discuss with regard to sexism in this whole gain of function and stuff. But I did want to point out that it was just, that's part. It's also like part of the thing that's very impressive for someone, like to be able like to be dealing with all of this stuff and then be so successful with it. So not to, I don't want to dwell on this, but anyway, I see I'm
Thank you. No, I appreciate it. Thank you.
I have, like I understand that mindset where the guys, like I have some of that horrible stuff in me as well sometimes, right? So I try to recognize. But the point is, like, anyway, sorry, save me, Justin, save me, Ryan. Anyway,
No,
I think you wouldn't hear that
I've been
language.
shocked by the contempt that has been shown towards, especially like female reporters, but towards a lot of the um, you know established scientists and uh, old old guard established journalists towards people working on this story. I mean, it's been shocking. Um,
Have you guys already spoken about the fact that in one of those early emails, Eddie Holmes says when he's discussing why they don't want to say that it was a lab leak, how he says Richard E. Bright, and a few others will use this to try and ban gain of function when we need it the most. Have you already spoken about that
oh,
email?
we haven't mentioned it yet. No,
I
but
think that's fascinating because
yeah.
that again, it's not just their reputation and the relationships and collaborations and scientific work they have with Chinese institutions, but that early email from Eddie Holmes saying Ebright and he mentions a couple of other scientists, we'll try and use this to ban gain of function research. So that was another reason. Oh, and then when we need it the most, that was another reason for another motive that in his own words in an email.
Oh yeah, and Ron Fouchier, in an email said something very much the same effect. And Ron Fouchier, of course, is world famous for making a strain of bird flu that can be easily transmitted by air between mammals, such as human beings. Um, and he's really the avatar for reckless gain of function research on deadly pathogens. And he also played a big role in shaping that paper, even though he was not listed as an author or in any acknowledgments. But yeah, it goes to show that they are. It's really disturbed me how they are, responding to the possibility of a lab leak the same way, a tobacco company executive might respond to, a report that smoking causes cancer, right? They're worried how it will affect their own bottom line and the freedom to do what they want to do. It's very
Do you think
troubling.
there will be any accountability here, though? Because obviously Nature Medicine is saying, look, it was just an opinion piece, it was a comment piece, so they're using that as a justification for not retracting it. The scientists are digging their heels in. There is a partisan element to it politically, of course, in the US. So do you think there will be any accountability, and how, in what form, could it come for the fact that the scientists did mislead us all?
I have no idea. I have no idea. I'm not. I don't hold out a lot of hope for personal accountability for people involved. I hold out more hope for a general change in attitude. Um, I think I for one know that a lot of scientists who were very closed off to the idea of possible laboratory origin of SARS-CoV-2 they're now curious, right? They now want to know more. And so I think the broader scientific community is becoming more open to the idea, even though um, the most influential elements in virology seem to be still circling their wagons. But as for accountability and if papers will ever be retracted,
The sad history is that there's a lot of papers that people know are absolutely wrong that have never been retracted, even though they've gotten tons of media attention. So I don't know what Nature Medicine is going to do, but I hope they'll do the right thing, and I think we should tell them that they should do the right thing. So, just a reminder: if any of you listening want to tell Nature Medicine to do the right thing, please consider signing our petition to Nature Medicine to retract the proximal origins paper.
And we appreciate Sharri you supporting that initiative. I honestly though, like I will say, like this is in our hands. This is not their decision. This is if we won't forget this, if we keep holding their feet to the fire, they're going to have to do it because it will become they will be unable to not do it. So it's sort of we really need people in the media to keep the pressure on, frankly. And I certainly am going to keep the pressure on in any way that I can because that paper represents the start of like a complete I mean, it is really the symbol of the government and the scientists conspiring together to say, you know what, we're just going to hoodwink the public and it's going to be okay. We're doing this. Maybe this is a noble lie. And as a scientist myself, it's disgusting. They use science to cover this fraud and deceit. And if that's what we allow as a scientific community, then we need to. I mean, how can one even be part of that? So it's incumbent on the scientific community to reject that. And as a member of the scientific community, I can't, in good conscience, not ever stop until that paper is gone. And really, like, yeah, to me, like it's such an egregious betrayal of everything you're supposed to be as a scientist. Um, it just has to go.
Yeah,
And if
no,
it doesn't go,
absolutely.
yeah. So I don't know. Like
That,
I think we make our future. We don't. This is the thing. Like I'm not going to sit here and say, "Oh, I hope Nature Medicine does." We're going to. They will have to. We will. I'm not talking about threatening or anything like that. I'm saying that the public, as more and more of the public understands what happened, it will not be feasible for Nature Medicine to not retract that paper. But it requires the public to rise up and say, we will not take it anymore. And that's the start. It's the first domino, as far as I'm concerned, because as soon as that paper goes, you're going to see a lot of other things get better, I believe. So I don't know. I'm actually kind of,
just
I
two
don't know.
other just two other points on that. I think it's important to remember, and I don't know why it's doing this. The other aspect that hasn't properly been covered yet, and maybe this is something Gary Raskin and Emily Copper are already working on, but is that we haven't seen the communications between the scientists and the tech giants and the social media companies. And
No, that's a very
because
good point.
because as we know, Facebook censored any idea of lab engineering, and the other. And even if the other tech companies didn't censor it, there still would have been correspondence with the scientists saying, this is misinformation, and maybe it was, what do you call it, downplayed, or on their algorithms it wasn't shared as much. I can't think of the term, muted. So I think that's another really, and I hope the US Right to Know group, I hope Gary Raskin and Emily Cobb are putting in FOIs around that, if it's even possible, through the scientists, through their universities. But
Sorry, Sherry, you cut out again.
I'm going to have to go in a minute, sorry, but can I just say also thanks, Sharri, for coming out and speaking on this event. And if you haven't read Sharri's book, What Really Happened in Wuhan, you should. It's an absolute tour de force. I've been attacked for saying Sharri's book is good because people think along politically partisan lines, and, you've got to just objectively evaluate facts. And, Sharri's book really is an excellent book if you're interested in some of the other lines of evidence that point to certainly, the possibility of a lab leak. Thanks, everyone. Also, we'll be putting up a written document, a sort of opinion piece about the Reedley lab incident and what it means, including for national security on the Biosafety Now website soon. Thanks.
Raina, by the way, I forgot to mention Dark Winter, your book. Everyone should read Dark
Yeah,
Winter.
everyone should read Dark Winter.
Yes.
It's really good. It's really good. I really enjoy. I learned a lot from it myself.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye, Raina.
So I don't know, Sharri, are you? I don't know if Sherry's still there or not. Oh, I think she's gone, unfortunately. Now we do have a couple questions. I don't know. Unfortunately, they might be for Sherry. Let me. Deepti, was this a question for Sherry? If so, I apologize. Deepti's connecting. Hi, Deepti.
Hi, thanks. This has been incredibly informative about something that I've been, trying to learn more about. I guess my question is, we may never know what actually happened, but what I don't understand is why there can't be a consensus about what needs to be done. I mean, clearly, of everything that's come out, what is very clear is that there is a level of conflict of interest in the scientific community, corruption of the scientific process, and that scientists cannot be relied on to regulate themselves. It's also clear that gain of function research is very risky and that the risks far outweigh the benefits. I mean, the fact that we are not sure that this could have been a lab leak itself says a lot to me. And what I don't understand is why there isn't a greater consensus about, well, the fact that gain of function research, needs to end or be far more strongly regulated just by knowing about, all the risky things that have happened in the past that have come out through the process of investigation and evaluation.
So,
Well,
go ahead, Justin. I'll wait.
yeah, yeah. Thanks, Deepti. No, that's a very good question. I'm very much of the same mind as you. Like, I don't. It's very frustrating to me that, um, the relevant people in charge can't come to kind of these obvious conclusions, even if even if we don't know exactly where SARS-CoV-2 came from. It is clear that it could have been produced by research, and by gain of function research, and that by and that something needs to be done about the possibility of that happening again. And I think the answer is that, well, at least from within the virology community, there seems to be complete denial that SARS-CoV-2 could have come from a lab leak. There, it's actually, a lot of prominent virologists have written papers saying that no, very condescending papers saying no, it's clear all the evidence points to a natural origin, therefore we need to focus on there. Yeah, maybe we should tighten some biosafety restrictions, but that will happen anyway, trust us. And what I've really taken away from this whole thing is that the virologists cannot be trusted to regulate their own research. That if they are given free rein to determine the relevant biosafety regulations and legislation, they will just continue doing incredibly risky research, um, either because they're blind to the risks or because they just, there's a financial incentive to continue doing risky research. So I think that citizens have to speak up. They need to make their voice heard. Um, and I think
Mention the petition, Justin. We got another petition
oh
for.
yeah.
What do you do? Yeah, but so Deepti, see, that's the thing. Biosafety Now. That's what our core mission is. See, this is the thing. So we
In large
want.
part, it's because
Yeah,
Bryce and I are so frustrated by exactly this question.
yeah, and we're scientists, so it's unique that we're actually part of the field. So it's difficult to sort of marginalize us and Richard because we're part of the field that you're saying, I don't understand why scientists are not just stopping this research. Neither do we. Neither do we.
Yeah, we
And
have
that's
no idea. We
a
think
real
it's
big
insane.
reason why this Biosafety Now exists. Our core mission is to, in essence, one of the core missions and a major focus is to just stop this ridiculous, super dangerous research that has never benefited humanity at all, in spite of what other scientists might claim. And in fact, probably has led to anywhere from 7 to 20 million deaths and all of this debilitating disease. And scientists are just pretending like nothing happened, or we still don't know. But as you point out, even if it was a natural origin, just the fact that there's a likelihood that it was through gain of function should raise serious alarm bells, and we should do something. So we need the public to mobilize. We can't, clearly scientists cannot do this on their own. They refuse to. If anything, they're trying to protect it. They need to be held accountable by the public. The public has to use their voice, and that's kind of what we're hoping to do with Biosafety Now, is to mobilize the public to make scientists work for on behalf of them, not the other way around. So yeah, I guess this is actually something, again, another part of that I get really upset about, which is it's inexcusable that our profession has allowed you to have that thought. Frankly, like why has nothing been done? I can't answer that question. We're trying to get something done. It's the best I can say.
Yeah,
So
and I just want to emphasize Deep D's point. Like, literally nothing has been done. Like, no biosafety regulations, at least in the United States, have changed in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Moreover, exactly the same type of incredibly risky, dangerous research continues to be pursued on a number of different viruses, including SARS-like coronaviruses, but other viruses like, MERS and bird flu. People continue every day to incredibly risky research, incredibly risky experiments on not just the natural pathogens, but genetically manipulated versions of those pathogens that are more dangerous to humans than the natural versions. So every single day that scientists sit around on their laurels and don't, pressure for new regulations or say that something needs to be changed, every single day endangers the entire world. That's really my point of view on this, and it's really terrifying, and I really hate to think so negatively of the scientific community, um, you know, uh, uh, but like that's how it appears to me.
thanks, Deep D. Do you have any other questions before I go to? I'm going to actually go to not. Sorry, Deep D. Do you have another question?
No, I just wanted to say that I don't even think it's like nothing has been done. I feel like the Eco Health Alliance has been actually rewarded with more funding. So,
Yes, they have.
exactly. So, I think if anything, the opposite has been done. And I think, regardless of the SARS-CoV-2 origin, I mean, we've learned that there have been other, well, really risky exposures from the Wuhan lab, and that's a matter of fact. I mean, I don't think that's deniable at this point. So I wonder if there's a consensus that can be built around what we already know about the things that have happened in the Wuhan lab and in other labs across the years, rather than something like this that, clearly is very divisive, even if absolutely plausible.
Sorry, you want to take that, Justin, or I can?
Why don't you take it, Bryce?
I guess maybe you're saying, actually, maybe I missed your question there, because are you asking why? Yeah, can you ask that question again? I think
Sorry,
I
I think what I'm saying is, in the investigations of the Wuhan lab and what's come out, it's very clear that there have been, well, previous near misses in the past, where,
yeah.
lab scientists have been exposed to dangerous pathogens. And there have been potential leaks in the Wuhan lab and in other labs across the world. So, there's a factual documentation of things that have happened that absolutely shouldn't have happened, that could have, potentially led to pandemics. They may not have, but they could have. And, those are facts that we do know. And that's come out through the investigation, of this. So I wonder
Right.
whether that can be used as a basis of building a consensus around the need to regulate.
I
Well,
think it's
it
it's
concerns me. I'll just jump in, Bryce.
yeah, go ahead.
So, I mean, it concerns me because these are well known. So, for instance, there were more lab leaks of SARS, of the original SARS virus, than there were spillovers of the original SARS virus. There are four confirmed, reported lab leaks, including one from a BSL-3 facility and one from a BSL-4 facility. Now, those could cause pandemics just like a zoonotic spillover can. And that was just like one virus. um, so, uh, you know, it's really, I am super concerned about this. I really worry that the virology community views biosafety as an occupational hazard issue and not as a public health threat. And I just think that that's just a messed up way of, you cannot think about potential pandemic pathogens that way. You might be able to think about like anthrax that way, or uh, other like microbial diseases that aren't easily transmissible between people, but potential pandemic pathogens, um, you know, it stops being an occupational hazard and starts being a major public health threat. And the safeguards only have to fail in one place in the entire world for there to be a pandemic. Um,
So,
so
Justin, I do want to. So this
yeah.
also points out like the insanity or whatever, like the fact that nothing has been done, and as you point out, Deepti, that there's been an increase in funding and support for EcoHealth Alliance, really points out that there's something really very wrong. One of the goals of Biosafety Now is to try to draw in people from across the political spectrum with a lot, like with various different viewpoints. I guess viewpoint diversity is going to be a huge strength in this fight because it really needs people like you to go out and talk to your friends and your family members and point this out to them, and so that they understand that science is a threat in many cases right now. And that's actually one of the reasons we have in our little description that we are trying to restore science to where it's benefiting humanity without simultaneously threatening it. Because we are at a point where scientists are ignoring and pretending that these threats don't exist. It's incredible. And I think many people just don't get that, like how that's possible, because we all love science and we all think scientists are great and doing noble things, but we have a lot of sort of people valuing their careers over the safety of the public. And it's, if you're following the COVID origins debate, I think you see that every day. It's very strange. But it's going to take a lot of people that can talk to different, groups, because my voice or Justin's voice is going to not resonate with a lot of people, but we have a lot of other people in our group that can make connections with, because it's not, this isn't left right, there's this has been politicized, and it's, that's part of the reason nothing has gotten done, because scientists have taken advantage of the political divisions in the country, so that they can protect their self-interest. So we, as we say, we welcome everyone across all political, the political divide, and across all perspectives on other issues, because fundamentally this, we believe, is an existential threat, the gain of function research, and we can't, we need to all work together to stop this, before we can even, well, anyway, that's my. I can keep going on and on about the power that we can have if we work together and put a lot of the other disagreements we might have aside.
Yeah.
What I would say.
So I just want to add to that there has been um, a really disturbing silence on this issue among, I think, most people in the scientific community. I think one thing that needs to happen is concerned scientists really need to speak up about this and be willing to, stick their head up above the crowd and say that, hey, they find this very concerning. I think there's been way too much silence among scientists, and I think scientists outside of virology, in particular, need to speak up. But the other thing that needs to happen is the public just needs to be alerted to this threat. Um, and like Bryce said, this is that part is the main reason we started Biosafety Now as a public facing organization, not as an organization meant to convince scientists so much as an organization meant to reach out to the public. And so I'm gonna make the pitch again. So Biosafety Now is a nonprofit organization. We're all volunteers, and we're run entirely on donations and sales of merchandise like Fear and Cleavage site mugs. And a large fraction of what we spend the money on is advertising to just reach out to other people on social media to alert them to these issues. So if if you believe strongly in this issue, consider donating at biosafetynow.org. We really appreciate it, and it'll really help the cause.
Justin doesn't believe that I can generate enough merchandise sales to not have to solicit donations. At some point, that's my goal, to just be able to sell so much merchandise we don't have to. Anyway, sorry. So let me go to not ostriching, and then I'll go to Marvin. You have a question? Thanks, Deepti, for your question.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, you
Yes,
can hear
not
me now?
ostriching. Go ahead. Yes, we can hear
Okay,
you.
thank you. I don't know if this is a little bit out of scope, but I'm just returning, and if you don't want to address it, that's fine, but I'm just returning to something that someone said previously. I forget who it was, but just a little bit about the chronology, because you all have followed it a lot more closely about COVID origins, just sort of out of intellectual curiosity and also just a personal anecdote as well. But someone said about how the genetic sequences were taken offline from the Wuhan lab in September of 2019. And I posted below in the chat an article which I came across a few months back about a study that was done in Barcelona of, I think it's like March of 2019, about COVID, SARS-CoV-2 being found in frozen wastewater samples from that date. So that's like a whole 6 months prior than anyone seems to be talking about. So I'm just curious if that, to you all who have been following this much more closely, if that report was substantiated anyway or refuted or what have you, because, that's just on a personal note, I've had sort of question marks in my mind because I actually, I have family in Spain, and I was traveling home in, like, let's say, I can't even remember now, but late August, September of 2019, and my son and I got very sick. We had strep when we got home, off the plane. He had actually been sick a few weeks prior in Spain, and went through, and I want to go back and get my medical records if I ever have time, but like September, October of 2019, I was incredibly sick with what are now, considered sort of the classic early COVID variants, symptoms of, loss of taste and smell for over 2 weeks. I was told at the time I had a sinus infection, but, now I wonder. And yeah, so that was September, October. And then a month later, even after I recovered, like, I was breathless and I needed inhalers, and I'm not an asthmatic. I don't generally have respiratory issues. So just question marks in my mind, and then, news also comes out that like people who are vaccinated post having an infection, are at more risk of X, Y, and Z. So, just for personal reasons and also just intellectual curiosity, I'm just wondering whether that report about those wastewater samples in Spain at such an earlier date, if there was any further news about that. So sorry, that was a little long-winded. I hope it made sense. Um,
Yeah, so thanks for asking the question. My understanding, I haven't done a deep dive into these early. So there's been a number of reports of um, of SARS-CoV-2 being detected in very early samples, either blood samples from patients or like wastewater samples. Um, my impression is that the people who've looked at that closely um, uh, all kind of have come to the consensus that anything before about November 2019 doesn't seem very plausible. There are a number of ways that um, those, like the tests on uh, the you know post hoc tests on these stored samples can give false positive results. Um, so I don't have a great understanding of that, but my impression is that basically everyone who looks seriously at the issue, regardless of whether they favor a natural origin or a lab leak, kind of believe that the virus really did have to originate um, in Wuhan in the fall, like October to November of 2019, somewhere around that time. So that's my current understanding.
But again, I will say we're not going to rule anything out because when you, as you've seen, you're not getting accurate information from what should be reliable sources. It calls everything into question. But yeah, I do agree with Justin that most believe that those might be, well, I don't even want to say most, but it's definitely worth a conversation. And I don't know enough about those particular papers. I've certainly heard about that. But yeah, I guess I'll say that when you have what's happened over the last 3.5 years, it's difficult to. There's so many things out in the scientific literature that need to be looked at very
Yeah.
carefully, and we're actually. I mean, Justin is starting to do that, so we hope to have some sort of more, like, scientific responses to some of these articles, the big ones.
No,
Regardless,
but it's
yeah.
really hard because there's so there's so many, to my mind, disingenuous arguments in the scientific literature regarding COVID origins. There's so many specious arguments and sometimes outright false statements um, in the published scientific literature on this topic. So it is really hard to find one's bearing on this issue by trusting the scientific literature. Um, yeah.
Marvin, you have another question?
Yeah, and a few comments. So I'm actually a closet physicist who likes to stay anonymous. But I would say about virology, it appears to me that virology is now the second science that is capable of wiping out humanity. Nuclear physics has been under strong restrictions since the Second World War. The question was asked, why would people do this if it's so dangerous? Scientists do things because they can. They're curious. They want to be the first. There's not even just financial incentives. They're motivated to discover, and if discovery is dangerous, some of them will not hold back. Nuclear physics is under export control. Whether there are technologies that can help somebody enrich uranium or whatever, you will go to prison if you give that to people who are not under clear control and following systems like the IEAE or bilateral agreements or whatever between America and Russia and mutual monitoring and so on. And I think a similar framework for approval and international visibility of the science that is being conducted and the safety of that science is absolutely necessary. And I guess the question would be, do you think there needs to be an equal level of rigor and control in virology as there presently is in nuclear science and enrichment and nuclear energy, etc.? Because I think it's very, very analogous, where you have a scientific capability that can actually wipe out humanity, right? You have to control it.
Yeah, so that's a really good question, Marvin. I'll also let you know that I'm a physicist, erstwhile physicist, um, and I completely agree. And actually, a large fraction of us at Biosafety Now, well, actually, if not most of us, also believe that we really need, like in the U.S., we need a new independent government agency, like the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, say the Pathogen Regulatory Commission or the Biological Regulatory Commission, that would um, enforce similar controls on pathogen research as exist on nuclear technologies. I think, uh, I think virology, you know, it's the most dangerous science right now by far. Um, and there are such paltry controls on it. It's really astonishing.
Virology is enormously cheaper than nuclear, uranium enrichment or whatever, and the critters self-replicate uncontrollably.
Right. Yeah, I know. That's why. Yeah, I mean the one saving grace with nuclear technology is that it actually, you know, it's really hard to make a nuclear bomb. It is far easier to make pathogens, and it's very concerning. It's very concerning, and I think the issue is incredibly urgent. So this is one thing that we would really like to see established is some serious regulation. And by the way, I should say that the civilian applications of nuclear technology are orders of magnitude higher than the civilian applications of gain of function research on potential pandemic pathogens. Um, so, you
And
know,
you're right too, Marvin, about they just do it because they can.
yeah, they just do it because they can.
It's
Yeah,
so disgusting, and but I would also urge you, to consider, because part of our problem with this is so many people don't want to speak out, and you have like a very reasoned tone, and the way you're talking about is very powerful. So I do kind of, one of the really telling things about this space is the difficulty with which people have even offering an opinion on this, which is crazy because we're talking about an opinion on something that could kill put everyone's lives at risk, and has already likely killed 20 million people. And the preferred narrative is to say, like, kind of ignore it and let these scientists bully the public into, do what we say, we're doing this on your behalf, you need to shut up. So I think, um, I, I guess to link it to this proximal origin thing, the reason why I think the proximal origin retraction would be such a powerful thing is because it would it would actually
Yeah.
take down the scientific establishment. It really would.
Can I
Yeah.
comment on this? This was actually my second comment, which is that as a physicist with something like 190 papers, right, the proliferation of opinion pieces and the deniability of opinion is corrosive. I have never published an opinion piece. I have published science that is reproducible. The the president of Stanford University just got made to stand down for non-reproducible science and paper retraction. There are many papers, not just the proximal origin, throughout this pandemic. The volume of opinion garbage. Children aren't super spreaders. Back to school. Oh dear, children do actually catch and transmit COVID. Oh, how could we have known? But it was just an opinion piece. Every single one of these should be retracted if they're proven false. Venturing an opinion is not adequate. It is not science. The volume of science now that is allowing opinion through and then deniability, every single one of these should be forced to be retracted, because that, we publish errata when there's a substatistical change, right? This needs forced retractions. Everything in this pandemic where people have just ventured garbage is going to turn into a cold. I'm an immunologist. Wait 5 years, it'll be seasonal, whatever. If these are wrong in retrospect, retraction should be forced and careers should be lost.
So this is, I agree to some extent with that, but we have to focus, like that's to me it's the tip of the spear, right? The proximal origins represents the worst of that.
Yeah, I agree. Go for proximal origins, and the rest will be frightened and stop being so courageous with their opinions.
That's what I think is. I that's exactly right, and I've tried to make this point with other people that have, they say, well, this is just a silly paper. It's one paper you disagree with. Oh no,
Justin, I would love to have a beer with you. I agree with you completely.
Yeah. Well, so the by the way, like, this is what I just don't get about proximal origins. I just do not understand how anyone who reads that paper, who understands its content, can consider it a valid paper. The arguments in that paper are so baldly flimsy, like it boggles my mind that people are still out there defending it. Even, I mean, the leaked Slack messages and emails between the authors are pretty damning. But the thing I find most damning is the content of the paper. The content of the paper makes no sense. The arguments, they present flimsy evidence and then come to very strong conclusions based on that flimsy evidence.
Now,
And
hold on,
it's just
Justin,
there for everyone to see.
Hold
So
on. You gotta do it meticulously. You gotta take it down the right way. Right?
They had patronage. That patronage carries influence, in my view, with the editorial of Nature. They were preemptively setting an agenda to defend science that probably had referees, when I say defend science, not defend science in general, to defend a specific science, the gain of function. That science had been under a ban from 2014 in the US, from 2014 to 2017, when the ban was repealed, right? And they were trying to preempt the criticism and say it was definitely not to stop a ban on that specific science. And it came with the support of the top of the NIH and with the top of the Wellcome Foundation, right? Who then, when I submit a paper, I sign a legal document that says everybody who contributed to this paper is an author. Right? And there were people who contributed to reviewing that manuscript, to instigating that manuscript, who were not authors because they didn't want to show their hand. And that is actually quite clandestine.
Well, and also you have to report conflicts of interest. And, to a scientist, there is like literally no bigger conflict of interest you can possibly have than to have the head of your funding agency giving you feedback on a manuscript.
And a conflict of interest is defending your very livelihood as an activity, right? It's not simply financial, direct, medical disclosures say, I got this funding from this company, I have these patents, yada, yada, yada. But I am writing this opinion in order to stop my field being cancelled and my career being lost is actually a conflict of interest.
Yeah.
So can I point out, okay, like we do now have in place the mechanisms to try, to start to get that paper, which I think is the signifier of all, could really lead to a lot of positive change to get it removed, which is, just we have the petition. I know it's an online petition, but understand that it does mean something when you see thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people sign that. It also has already been covered in the news. We've had articles written about that petition when it was in the mid thousands. And I think that's the powerful thing about those petitions, which is that news journalists report that, oh, there's thousands of people that say this should be retracted. It led to people having to comment about it. Eddie Holmes made a comment about it. The editor of Nature Medicine made a flippant remark about it. The more and more people sign that, the more and more we get the possibility it gets covered. It stays in the public domain, and eventually this is going to happen. But we cannot let the pressure up. So again, I would just encourage, if you haven't signed that petition, please do. I understand it's an online petition, but even understand we got news coverage because of that online petition. We also have the letter. Now the letter, which was submitted, and we finally got a response that it was received from the journal yesterday. Richard indicated that. The remarkable thing about that letter is that only maybe 50, now a little bit over 50 STEM and STEM policy professionals have signed that. Now, think about what that says, because many STEM and STEM policy professionals agree that it should be retracted, but it's been very difficult for them to put their name on that document because they fear there might be some career damage to them or reputational harm. Think of what that says about the entire STEM and STEM community if we cannot put our names on a paper that says lying and fraud and deceit is bad.
Yeah,
So
and it's not like we're just asking virologists. We're asking people from all of STEM and STEM aligned fields. And so many people are so reluctant to actually, you know, speak up for what they believe in.
I solemnly promise I will sign in my real name.
That would be great, Marvin. That would be great.
Tom, go ahead.
Hi, yeah. I think the interesting thing would be to push back on the assertion that there were no cases early on, because I know that there are good sources for novel pneumonia going around the Wuhan area, going back to September, August. I've seen, well, I personally know a scientist who works in concert with other scientists in the US, who has contacts with a group of scientists in Wuhan, and at the time in 2019, they were all aware of novel pneumonia going around Wuhan, to the extent it was causing hospitalizations and deaths. And then later on, when it came out about COVID, they were all, well, that's what that was then. I've also seen in, I think, January 2020, there's a video online where a PhD student in Wuhan is interviewed by an Australian journalist saying how this novel pneumonia was going around in September and how they had to be very careful when they were speaking about it. I can provide a link to that interview. I think it's very clear that this was going around in August, September, and potentially that then led to, I mean, there's some discussion that there were infections actually within one of the labs later. Now, that may have been related to investigating that earlier outbreak. Now, I'm not saying it's necessarily that COVID came from a lab, but there may have been an earlier zoonosis or an earlier leak of a sample from a lab or from a captive bat or from some local villager collecting guano could have been infected. But whatever, there was an earlier stream of cases going back to August, September.
Thanks, Tom. So again, this is an issue. I'm actually very confused about it because I've seen those reports too. Like, the U.S. State Department was aware that Wuhan was having a very bad flu season long before any COVID cases were detected. So, no, I'm very confused about this myself, about the early dates.
Hey, Ryan,
As I said earlier, Justin, I think this completely correlates to the fact there were multiple strains on initial detection, right? It had time to evolve and diverge, and it's quite possible that it diverged to a more infectious strain, which then exploded.
Well, so the thing that confuses me though is that the people who quantitatively model this um, don't seem, including people who consider lab leak possible, they seem to point to these later dates of like November.
I would say
So
that
that's what really confuses me about that.
my
Is
understanding
like,
of that is that they don't actually do that. Is that what they say? If you look at that, when they look at the mutation rate and try and project back to when this started, they say that it started back around October. Now that's before proximal origins. Now, if you then say, well, these things are only an estimate, it's not really much to push back
It,
from October
it,
to
it's,
August.
it's also the case that multi-exponential fits are enormously difficult, right? If you had an event where the exponent of growth changed to a higher exponent, you would only resolve the higher exponent, right? It could be
right,
there was an
right,
initial case with a slowly growing initial variant spreading over a couple of months, and then bang, you get a new variant and you get this rapid second exponent. And any fits you do to backwards extrapolate will miss that first exponent.
right, right. Raina, did you have any? Raina's back. Do you have any comments on this subject?
Sorry, I only just rejoined, so I'm probably not up on the whole conversation. Can you
Oh,
summarize quickly?
oh, it's about when the cases that emerge. Well, there's evidence that there was spread going around in Europe, in Spain,
Yeah.
that stuff.
Yeah, so there's some serological studies that showed that COVID was already circulating in the US in December, and other studies, including serology and some other sampling studies, that suggest it was in Europe in November. So that's again part of the different lines of evidence that you need to look at when assessing the origins.
First of all, hi, Raina. Great to speak to you in person. Secondly, to summarize the prior conversation, both Tom and I have kind of independent reasons to say that perhaps there was an earlier spillover event, whether it came through a lab or not, whatever, maybe September, maybe even August timeframe, and that there was some slow growth, and then perhaps some subsequent mutation event which increased the growth rate, maybe around November, and that would explain the two initial strains and all of the activity in September that's been quoted in Wuhan. And Tom has his own private sources that he explained at some level through research connections and so on. And there's also all of the activity at WIV in September with databases being taken offline and so on. But there are multiple sources of evidence that might suggest that there could have been an earlier release, however it happened, whether natural or unnatural, and then potentially a second mutation event which increased the growth rate. And the sort of suggestion was the epidemiology said, well, it was November, October, but if there was a mutation that increased the growth rate, you would never see that early initial strain that then mutated, right? And this would also tie in with the Alina Chan and pre-adapted, etc., because if it was already circulating and then adapted, that would explain the pre-adapted.
Yeah, though the presence of two different variants or, strains early on can also be because there were lots of different experiments that were generating slightly different
Yeah. Certainly,
variants,
experiments explain the correlation. Two spillovers from animal sources does not explain twice lightning striking twice in the same
I mean,
place.
I think the other thing is that the bats from Yunnan province were just too far away to explain it easily through a natural, and no intermediate host has been found that could plausibly explain it. So the horseshoe bats, so I think there's less supporting evidence for that natural origins theory. But the other one of the interesting bits of information that came out was through the wastewater surveillance, that there were signals for SARS-CoV-2 earlier than December from the wastewater in Europe, but there was one, retrospective wastewater sample from March 2019 reported by authors from Spain, found in Spain in March 2019. So that would kind of explain what you just said, Marvin, that an earlier version wasn't as contagious, because if it had the kind of reproductive number that the original strain had, it wouldn't have just appeared in March and then
March seems
disappeared.
so ridiculously
It
early that
does, it does,
lab.
yeah,
I do
yeah.
suspect
But the
sample
interesting thing
contamination.
is, like when I was taught field epidemiology, I had a great teacher who told me that never ignore the outliers, always look at the outliers. But in science, what we see quite often with journal editors and journals, and I know this being a journal editor myself and submitting papers to journals, that when you present something that's outside of the dominant thinking in science, often they'll ask you to remove it. The reviewers will say, take that out, it doesn't make sense, right? So those Spanish authors, they published it in a preprint that they found this sample in March, but the final publication had nothing about that. My guess is they were asked to remove it. It could have been a lab error, it could have been a testing error, I don't know. I
I
actually
mean,
emailed the authors to ask them, but never got a response. So that's an interesting little tidbit.
the question is whether they retested, and the question is whether there was some kind of sample contamination. It's really disappointing that they did not make a statement.
Well, it's there in their preprint. It just wasn't there in their final
But
publication.
if you change the preprint, you should say why they changed the preprint, right? They should make a statement that either they retract and said we made a mistake, we reran the sample and it didn't show up the second time, so we think we contaminated it in the lab, or they should say
Or the
we stand by
reviewer
what we
said
said,
remove
right?
it.
But they have to say why they changed, right?
Yeah.
And they didn't. That's unscientific.
But the most likely thing is the reviewer said that I don't understand that, it doesn't make sense to me, take it out.
But
yeah,
that's fine. But they then have to say this was not believed, so we have taken it out, right? It's unscientific to just
but
excoriate their previous preprint, right?
But that happens so often, it's not.
Well, they have to grow up and behave like scientists, right? I would, in my field, we would never go away from a statement we've put in the archive without an explanation as to why we changed that statement.
This might
right?
also
And part of
be
the scientific process, if they agreed with the referee that what they previously said was wrong, it's only scientific to say why what they previously said was wrong.
This might also be somewhat of a difference between how preprints are used in biology and physics.
I'm sitting in review with a paper that's been in review for 4 years, and we're still arguing with the sodding referee, right? And we're explaining the changes in our data points, right? And that is natural. That's proper science.
Well, yeah. Tom?
I'd also say that there was clear evidence beforehand that China was interested in weaponizing biotechnology, and there are multiple sources on that. Now, while I don't rule out there could have been an earlier zoonotic origin, because I'm not convinced that there's no means for an earlier an earlier contact with an animal from a wildlife farm, etc. I think that still remains a possibility. We certainly know that China had stated intention to weaponize biotech, and if you look at the people from Approximate Origins,
Right.
I think there was an interview recently, or I think there's an interview I was watching back between Warraby and someone else, and they were rubbishing the fact that there could be any possibility or any reason why China would be researching in secret. Well, that's just nonsense. I mean, it's quite clear that they had a stated aim to weaponize biotechnology.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. I think the poo-pooing of the bioweapons angle is baseless. And I don't think China's the only one who is interested in developing bioweapons agents.
In all fairness, Tom, China put in a statement. I've read what Sharri linked to in the UN. They said to the UN, the Bioweapons Treaty, that racially targeting viruses was theoretically possible. They didn't say that was their aim. And in putting it into the UN bioweapons treaties, they're saying this could be done. Shouldn't we regulate it? Right. So there are multiple interpretations of what they said, and I know there were, and you've seen your link on YouTube of a Chinese general saying, "Oh yeah, we'll just wipe out the rest of the world, and we'll be fine with some subtitle translation." But that doesn't mean that was necessarily China's policy and goal in submitting this to the UN bioweapons. The repeat reviews of the bioweapons treaty.
I agree. I
One
wasn't
possible
referring.
interpretation is they're saying this could be done. Shouldn't the treaty be revised to stop this being done? Right, and I certainly don't have a naive point of view about military attitudes to any potential weapon. Right, the first thing that, as I said, I'm a physicist. The first thing that politicians and military did when we gave people a weapon that could wipe out the entire surface of the earth was to just use it on a city, on a populated center. And we have blood in our hands as a field in physics, right? And but I don't necessarily say that China stated their intent to do this.
But there have been.
I just need to clarify here.
Yeah, go
I
ahead,
wasn't
Tom.
I wasn't suggesting that China have said at any point they intended to release a bioweapon on the rest of the world. No, absolutely not. But if you look at their internal communications, the communications to their own people in the press, they had a stated aim to weaponize biotechnology, not to actually necessarily use it, but for aggressive and defensive purposes, just like people in the West have done. Just so they have the potential to have the technology available as a strategic interest. I'm not saying they were planning to use it.
Yeah, I'm not saying that that's what you said either, Tom. But I'm also not clear that they really said to the UN that they intended to develop it. They warned the UN that this was possible. Whether they did or not, certainly there's a Times article that suggests that actually the military marched into WIV and took over and took hold of a lot of research programs, right? And I don't know, they cited unnamed sources for that, so it's a little bit difficult to verify, but there are hints that there was a significant military involvement in WIV.
Yeah. I mean, there is a significant military involvement in the WIV, and my understanding, I'm remembering this from I think a podcast that the Times did, or maybe it was the Sunday Times, that there have been papers published by the military talking about weaponizing coronaviruses. So it's not clear that's China's policy, but there's certainly been discussions of it within China.
I wanted to actually kind of wrap up. Thank everyone. Raina, did you want to say any final words for the second time, I guess.
No, thank you.
Thanks a lot, everyone, for joining. Again, please sign our petitions, both to ban gain of function research and to retract proximal origins. And I will. Oh, Tom, you have one question. All right, Tom. You want to say final words? Go ahead.
Very quickly. I'm just going to send a couple of links to the message thread associated with the chat. So if people want to have a little look at the evidence I'm talking about, it'll be there.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks for participating. And of course, what you can do. Let me think. Well, if you want to sign up, we have a mailing list on our website you can sign up for. Usually, I do announce the Twitter Spaces through that mailing list too. If you miss it on our Twitter feed, obviously we publicize it there too. But we'll hope to have another space soon. In fact, I don't know if Emily will say words about this, but I'm hoping Emily will come on and speak about all the stuff she's doing, looking at the Slack chats and emails around the construction of proximal origins. We're hoping to do a proximal origins based space very soon, obviously, with what's going on there. So, anyway, that's great. Thank you all for joining us, and hopefully, we will. I guess I don't actually. I have to come up with a good catchphrase. I haven't figured that out yet. Anyway, take care. Thanks for joining us. We'll talk to you soon.